Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Hall, and this is a special episode recorded on location at the Craft Malt Conference that was recently held in Portland, Maine. I'm going to be joined by a trio of brewers who discuss their use, or not, of craft malt in their beers. And we'll get into it in a moment. But first, please visit allaboutbeer.com. There, you can find original articles, reviews, news, insights, and podcasts. You can listen to shows like Beer Travelers, Brewer to Brewer, and the All About Beer podcast simply by searching All About Beer wherever you listen to shows. This show and all of the work we do is supported by you. You can visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to help keep the content fresh. And a reminder that a few bucks goes a long way to fund writers, photographers, creators, and editors. And if you'd like to learn more about advertising on this show, please email info@allaboutbeer.com. And if you're a smoked beer fan, and of course you are, go check out This Week in Rauk Beer. Search the Facebook group or follow on Instagram and Twitter at TW Rauk Beer. And of course, don't forget Camp Rauk Beer coming up at Brewery, Brewing and Blending on May 9th, 2023, starting at about 5 o'clock. It's going to be some of the best Rauk Beer brewers from around the country, all pouring their smoky delights. Is craft lager having a moment? It's certainly gained popularity on taproom menus around the country, and it's showing us the diversity of styles and flavors that can be enjoyed in this category. But where does craft malt fit into these styles that are so driven by the flavors and functionality of malt? This panel that you're about to hear brings together three brewers from the Northeast to discuss their lager programs and how, when, and why they choose to use or not use craft malts in the development of their beer recipes. I'll do a full introduction on the tape, but you'll hear from Sean Towers from The Seed, a living beer project, Michael Fava of Sacred Profane Brewery, and Justin Slotnick of Schilling Beer Company. And during the question and answer portion at the end of the show, we're going to get some great insight from Daniel Carey of New Glarus Brewing. Here's our panel discussion.
And one of the cool things about covering beer is that it's not just the liquid itself, but covering beer is a story of architecture. It's a story of art, and it is very much a story of agriculture. And so being here today to talk about craft malt and how it's being used in beer, I'm really excited. The idea behind this originally was to spark a conversation about mash bills for craft lager and having three brewers who come from different perspectives on the panel. The always uses craft malt, the sometimes uses craft malt, and because every good story needs a villain, the brewery that never uses craft malt, like Fava. It's going to be a redemption story. You're gonna go from villain to hero all throughout. So let me introduce our panel. Sean Towers is the co-founder, owner, and operations lead of The Seed, a living beer project in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He's operated breweries at various scales in New Jersey over the last 10 years, while simultaneously managing a university-based bivalve shellfish aquaculture research lab. With a background in microbiology and marine biology through his decade plus of brewery, aquaculture, and environmental experience, Sean has continued to expand upon a lifelong reverence for the natural world. Both his current brewery and aquaculture work allow him to explore his passions for local ingredients, the growers behind such ingredients, embracing seasonality and preservation. Justin Slotnick got his start as a home brewer in 2006 while a student at George Washington University. After moving back to his home state of Massachusetts, he began volunteering at Trillium Brewing, helping with everything from cleaning out the building to brewing pilot batches. When Trillium opened a year later in 2013, he was employee number 3, primarily responsible for cellar work and retail sales. In 2016, he traveled to South Carolina to help build out the Charlestown Fermentory and spent 4 years as assistant brewer, retail manager, and trivia host.
Yes, every week.
Wow.
Every week.
All right. So we're going to end this. You're going to throw out a couple of questions at the end.
No.
Okay. Thought you guys were fun. All right. This is why you come to rehearsal. Looking to move back to New England and jump headfirst into the world of brewing, he took the job of production manager brewer at Schilling Beer Company in Littleton, New Hampshire in January 2021. And that's where he lives with his partner, Julie, and their dog, Hazelnut. Michael Fava is the director of operations at Sacred Profane. He has operated breweries in Philadelphia and Maine for the last 15 years. He is a highly respected member of the global beer community, specializing in lagers, farmhouse ales, you wrote this, lagers, farmhouse ales, mixed fermentation, and barrel aging. His background is in engineering and business and has led to multiple brewery commissions and designing custom brewing equipment. He has a passion for sustainability, agriculture, and a particular affection for historic and traditional techniques. He is also a father as of a month ago, a brand new father as of a month ago. So trivia, dad jokes, and Sean, we're going to find your hidden talent in a few minutes. But Sean, let's start with you because we're here to unlock lager's mystique with specialty and craft malts. And lagers in the craft space, while maybe not so new, have gained a lot more interest as of late. Ashley Carter of Beer Stout Lager House in Denver likes to say that lager's on a 500-year winning streak, so she doesn't understand why everybody's starting to talk about it now. But where do you come from when thinking about specialty malts and your brewery, and in particular the lagers that you're making?
So where we come from with the lagers that we're making is actually not lager derived at all. Our brewery was really founded on like a philosophy and ethos of saison. So my partner Amanda and myself have been brewing for a little over a decade at this point, all in New Jersey for a couple of other breweries, running a variety of programs, and really just fell in love with mixed culture beer and the story and the kind of like beauty behind all of that. So we went off on our own to open our own project focused on saison. And for us, that really meant local ingredients, brewing with the seasons, and kind of letting nature take its course and somewhat minimal intervention. Somewhere along that line, we fell into the rabbit hole of lager, which for us was, I think, a little more culture derived. We found that everything we wanted to be doing around this ethos of saison also really wrapped in a lot of old world European beer culture, which is a big thing that I think has been missing from the American beer scene for a while. And the lager culture in particular for us really just has drawn us in for a very long time. We just didn't think we'd be so focused on making them. If you ever come to our brewery, it's not set up to make lager at all. But with all that in mind, we make a ridiculous amount of lager for what we were planning at this point. And we really just try to stream that thread of local ingredients and seasonality into that lager program as best possible. So for us, lager is like a really clean slate for us to challenge ourselves from a process and a brewing standpoint. And also, since she's front and center here, to give Hillary's Rabbit Hill Malt a little bit of a showcase at the brewery as well without the microbes taking over as much. So that's kind of the blanket brushstroke answer to our lager journey right now.
Mike, can we talk about your lager journey? Because you have a lager-centric brewery. Like, you're not allowing ales to show up at your brewery.
No ales.
No. And Sean just sort of talked about some of the history and tradition of which I've come to understand your brewery is deeply, deeply focused on.
Very much so. Yeah, we set out with the ideal. We wanted to set up a lager brewery. The state of Maine, although they have there's over 175 breweries, there's not one brewery dedicated to lager production. So starting with the ideal, and if you know my wife Brianne Allen, she's a career brewer as well, specializing in lager production. Same with me. We're both very passionate about lagers, particularly Czech lagers. And we wanted to start with the ideal. We make two beers, pale lager and dark lager, doing them as traditionally as possible. Meaning we did set up a decoction brew house. We were able to design all of our equipment between the two of us, which was really an amazing process. And using the raw ingredients that are going to make that authentic, and going down that rabbit hole on what that means to the country of Czech Republic is something I'm hoping to unpack a little bit today, because that story is really awesome, and why Sacred Profane has opened and why we're doing what we're doing.
And we'll definitely go down that rabbit hole. But Justin, from your brewery, from your brewery perspective, what does lager mean? Where does lager fit into what you're doing these days with Schilling? Sure.
So Schilling's been open now for about 10 years over in Littleton, New Hampshire, which is about 2 hours and 45 minutes from here in the White Mountains. The owners had spent a lot of time in Europe, they set out to brew lagers in the States. They were maybe a little overly optimistic with what they could do when they opened up in a 1790s grist mill and decided to put the brewing operations basically behind the bar / kitchen in whatever little space they had with some tanks down in the basement. But, being kind of ahead of it 10 years ago has really helped Schilling kind of be ready to dive headfirst into some more historical styles of lager brewing, really go deep into ingredient choices and like I said, styles, and really just hone in and focus on that, and the kind of the revival of interest in lagers, because they've been around forever. We're not finding something new, but the interest in the craft brewery consumer, that has gone through the roof lately, which has been great for us and for probably all of us up here and a lot of other brewers in the. I don't know how many other brewers are in the room, but it's been a good boon. So for Schilling, it's like lager production is 80% of our production. It's something that we really. Every beer we want to make good, but we hang our hat on the lager production and really take our pride in that.
Sean, when it comes to, I find it interesting that you're saying that there's not much new to discover, because I in talking with maltsters and talking with brewers that are using craft malt, there is some excitement of some new varietals that have come up, or different ways that things are being malted, or just working with farmers to say, okay, how can we do something different? How can we do something to make these beers stand out? Sean, when you're having the conversation with Hillary about what she's growing and what you want to make, what do those conversations look like or sound like?
A lot of times they're less so a conversation and more so Hillary and team are stoked on some grain that they're growing and send some bags down and we work with it. But yeah, we work very closely with Hillary and the whole team up there for, not just new grain varietals, but what they're seeing on the farm, what they're seeing in the malt house, what they're able to kind of just pass across the road to us and say, hey, the 2-row barley crop this year, these varietals are looking this way. We think you should adjust your brewing process a little bit. For our relationship, though, I think we can be just as much of a sounding board for the farm as the farm can be for us, in respect to the actual grains that we're working with and the varietals and the kilning methods and the malting methods and so on and so forth. For the original point that I made, like, we don't have flagship beers per se. We rotate our brands quite a lot. We do pale lagers. That's going to land in a wide variety of different beers that we're making. So for us, it's nice when Hillary is really excited about a product, about a grain, about a raw grain, about a new malting technique, that they can bring a few bags to us. And we're really small. We're doing like 7 or 15 barrel batches. So we can do a 7 barrel turn of, like, Vienna malt was a good example. When the farm started kilning working through a Vienna malting process, we brought 8 or 10 bags in, and we had some friends up from Florida, and we brewed a Vienna lager. And that was to test the malt and to see how it works on our system. And then we can collectively make decisions moving forward on what we would like to see differently or what we liked about it.
Justin, what are your conversations like with the maltsters you're working with?
Sure. So there's the non-existent conversations with the big malt company that we use out of Germany. And then there are some very in-depth conversations that we have with some more local malting companies. Schilling, when it comes to local malt, we primarily work with Andrea and Christian over at Valley Malt. We've been working with them for a while. Some of it is pretty routine of like this year, Schilling is switching all of its wheat over to locally malted wheat, locally grown wheat. And that's been a big step for us. And some of it's a little more in depth about looking for a certain product, looking for a certain methodology behind it, or a certain growing region. Something that Andrea and I have been talking a lot about is just finding a barley variety that works really well for our Pilsner production, that's grown as close as we possibly can get to the brewery. So we've been kind of keying in on that, trying to find something through sensory analysis that she's been doing and has been done by the lab that she works with, and then also like just the sensory analysis of our team, and ultimately the sensory analysis of the end product that we're getting towards pretty soon, which is really exciting for us. So yeah, it can be of two ways. I mean, there's some products that we use that are a little more customized for what we're trying to do, and then there's some products that we use from them that it's, we're not as focused on exactly which farm it came from or exactly what the conditions were for that malting process.
All right. So, Michael, talk to us about the malt that comes into your brewery.
Yeah, luckily for me, back in 2019, I was selected to be on a sponsored trip to the Czech Republic, put on by the Ministry of Agriculture. I don't know how or who nominated me as a North American brewer that makes European styles. And anyway, I was very lucky to go on this trip. It was a very organized and choreographed trip where we went around the entire country, from breweries to maltsters to hop growers. Got to see this whole entire beautiful country that was designed to make beer somehow by like nature. There's landrace varieties of hops and landrace varieties of barley that just happen to be in that region for millennia. So what lucky people, and what a wonderful place in the world. It was there, tasting beer, amazing pale lagers, obviously that you would expect. And like any curious brewer, going into, even though it wasn't part of the tour, taking a peek into the grain rooms and mills, and the favorite beers that I had were all using this one particular malt from Raven Malt. And that was not available in the US. So I talked to some, when I got back from that trip, talked to some importers and started getting containers imported to North America. This one was a stint at Oxbow Brewing, 9-year stint. Selfishly wanted to use this grain, right? It was after starting importing it that really learned more about why it tastes the way it does and what's going on there, and realizing that there's a geographic protection indication, an EU protection to call Czech beer Czech beer. And part of that is using Hannah variety of barley. If you're not using that variety of barley, you're not making Czech beer. So when we're setting up, amongst other things, you have to use, you can't just make a pale lager and throw some Saaz from Germany or somewhere else and then call it a Czech style beer. There's a lot of checkpoints that you have to meet. But barley being the
That was the dad joke.
That was the dad joke.
Yeah.
That was it. Yep.
There'll be more.
Yeah. For those of you keeping score. Yeah.
Anyway, where was I? There's not much sleep going on around here. Just starting with the ideal, we start up our brewery. We want to be authentic to what we're claiming to brew and to the friends that we've met in that country, and agreeing and aligning with their ideals is using these ingredients, these raw ingredients. Agriculture there is so revolving around beer production. It's amazing. Not to talk about hops, but every third grader has to go to hop harvest as part of school, for instance. So it's just this beautiful, if you like beer and you go there, you're just so inspired, like we were. So I don't know if that answers the question.
So for the beers that you're making then, there is no alternative in your mind?
No.
Are you open to making other styles of beer? Like, I mean, you're sitting here, you're around folks who are growing grain. I mean, what are you looking for, if anything, for smaller producers, from smaller producers that you could potentially incorporate into your beers one day? Or is that just so far off on the horizon that?
Yeah, hopefully the brewery goes well and we never have to brew anything besides these two beers. So we set this brewery up so we can deep dive and get into knowing these ingredients so intimately that we can tell a difference season to season. And the more you brew and the more different styles, the less opportunity there is to deep dive into one beer. And that was so important to us, was not to be a brewery that makes good beer. We want people to know a specific beer and get it to be a habit, get it to be intimate, not with our brewery, but with the individual beers. But that said, we're both beer lovers. We do still collaborate with other breweries, and I think that's an opportunity for the innovation that small producers and new things happening in the industry. It'd be silly to lose sight of what's happening, and being excited about it. And certainly, my tenure at Oxbow was very much revolving around using craft malt, different raw grains. And just being a brewer is, being a student for life. And if you're not continually learning, you're not doing it right. So that's why I'm here.
Justin, as you think about hops came up, and so for those of you who don't spend too much time around breweries, there are insufferable beer nerds who will show up and ask for specific beers by specific hops. Like, oh, does this one have Mosaic, or where's your El Dorado, and things like that. And there's not a lot of conversation that centers around malt from the consumer standpoint. And so, Sean and Justin, I'm curious if you're able to create a new narrative with consumers based on the specialty malts that you're using, the craft malts that you're using, to sort of push that consumer conversation into a direction, beyond whatever the hop of the moment is.
You want to start? Sure, I'll start. I think that's one of the more difficult things right now. I think personally, from a consumer standpoint, I think grain varietals are less exciting than a hop varietal because it's not thrown in people's face as much. But just like anything else, it's an agricultural product, right? So like if you go into the, hypey IPA world and you have a beer with whatever Nectarone in it, Nectarone's not the same depending on where you get it from. It's still based on the grower and the climate and processing techniques and everything. And I think that's an important educational component that we're trying a little bit to work on. We did a beer last year, just called Donko. It was a Donko rye varietal that Hillary's growing, and it was, Amanda might remember the grist better. I think it was 75% rye, single cultivar rye. The label for that beer was just, a head of the blade of grass and showed some grain kernels. And the idea is to try to help kind of teach people a little bit more that, it's not just a rye lager. It's not just an amberish lager. It's a Donko rye lager, and specifically what that rye varietal tastes like grown at one specific farm in one specific season. So to answer your question, I think we're very far off from having folks be excited for grain varietals, but I think it's something fun to work towards.
Justin, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have to kind of start from the beginning, because when the New England IPA revolution was happening, it was really teaching all these customers, and sometimes having them teach you about these different hop varieties and what makes them unique, what makes them all taste the same. Sorry.
Shots fired.
But
oh man.
Nobody cared what the malt bill was that was backing that. So for, being at one of those breweries that was starting up in that time, we had an opportunity to kind of show consumers why this is so important to us. And now, 10 years later, it's like breweries have to do the same thing, but they have to do it with malt. And I already think that like our keynote speaker was saying earlier, like the test case is there. Like, we've done this before. We've done this with hops. Wine growers have done it with grapes. Small food bread makers have done it. Like, there's all sorts of places to learn from, and how that's going to be part of the marketing, part of the storytelling. Staff education is a huge part of it. Our bartenders and our salespeople interact with the customer way, way more than I do. So making sure that they have the same information that we do, giving them opportunities to also go to a farm, to also visit a malting facility, to have education through different programs that they can learn about this stuff, so that they're equipped to answer questions in the tap room or out in the field. Because I can speak for forever about why lager brewing or why malt choices are important to me, and why the 2% of the grist bill that was comprised of this one thing really drives that beer and makes it unique and makes it different. But if our sales rep or our bartenders or our waitresses don't care, then it's like, the end consumer is not going to ever get that. So getting that passion across to the end consumer, I know that was a part of the last conversation of like, how do we get the end consumer to care about the grain choice, for example. Well, we've done that with hops. We just have to show that same passion and really drive home what makes it cool and what makes it unique.
Mike, do you find that you're able to have a conversation with about malts to your customers that come through because of the nature of what you're using and because it is such an important part of your story for the beers that you're making? That, I almost felt like when you were talking about the malt, I almost like set up a little bit straighter because you're talking about it with reverence. You're coming at it from a really altruistic perspective. Do you find that you have an easier time talking to folks at the bar about your raw ingredients because of the beers that you're making?
Absolutely.
And do they get it?
They get it, I think, because it is contagious when you start to talk really excited about something. And the story behind it of, we didn't just go to the store and get this. We had to travel, and then there's a lot of barriers to get it to our door and incorporate it in our product. So that story is very intoxicating to people. They latch right on. Of course, I follow it up with like samples, like, hey, chew on this, and like really get into talking about it. That's always been part of my story about beer. I think obviously hops are showy; they're the frontman of the band, so to speak. But I'm a rhythm section guy and want to give the drum and bass or the malt the credit that it deserves, and that's what's defining the beer. So I've always tried to, anytime giving a tour, I think talking about malt is the story more than anything. It's what's defining the beer styles that you're brewing, and more people should give it the focus.
Yeah. Sean, Justin, in talking about the stories and in talking about the malts, the specialty and craft malts that you're using, what have you found is helpful in what's being communicated to you from the farms, and what would you like to see more of to help deliver that message to the end user, to the final consumer?
So my history of talking with maltsters, because I had very rarely had occasion to talk to farmers until pretty recently, and then like yesterday talked to a seed breeder, and I'd never done that before either. So peeling back some of the layers on this has been cool for me. But I definitely was one of those people that when a local maltster showed up, I was like, your stuff's going to be too expensive for us. It's not going to have the efficiency that we're looking for. Thank you, but no thanks. And the persistence of some of those maltsters, and then just me growing as a brewer, I feel like I've learned that was a horrible way to look at things. And I now have an appreciation for what they're doing. And getting at what we're looking to hear more of, I think is a little bit of the story, but also a little bit of like what works for the farmer and what works for the maltster. Because I think a lot of my original feeling around this was, well, if I tell the maltster and I tell the farmer, this is what I want, then I'm going to get what I want. But that might not be what they're actually good at. They might be a better grower of a specific variety of barley, or a better grower of wheat or rye. The malting company may specialize in a certain thing that is going to therefore be the best representation of what they're offering us. And it's better to focus on that. So I hope that malting companies or farmers, when they go to breweries, they don't get people like what I used to be, which was well, I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm using, and I want you to make something exactly like that, and trying to get beyond that to learning what it is that makes the product that you're offering better, unique, something that has a story behind it. It's something that I geeked out about. Mike was talking about Hannah Malt, and I found out through Andrea at Valley Malt that there's a farm in New York that grows a Hannah varietal, and Valley Malt malts it, and now we use it. We were brewing with it yesterday. And that kind of like that realization that like kind of turned the full circle for me of understanding a little bit better as to what like that farmer loves that varietal apparently. And that works really great for him. And it was like, perfect. That's also like a cool piece of a story for us because we make Czech beers as well. So we wanted to have, and we used the Raven malt. It's beautiful. I love it. Thank you for getting it over here. But it was really cool to find that there's somebody else that's got another piece of that, and that we could use and feature.
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I think another aspect also, so I'm not just repeating everything that Justin's saying, is quite simply proximity. Amanda and I can hop in the car and in less than an hour be in Hillary and Blair's kitchen sharing a couple beers and talking about some more unique heirloom cultivars that we'd like to hopefully see them test plot this upcoming season. And that can happen with any grower and any brewer or any end user. But again, just from a proximity and ease standpoint, we can do that face to face a lot easier than planning a trip, hopping on a plane to the Czech Republic and, figuring out how to leave the brew pub and the baby accounted for at any point. So I think that's one of the biggest pluses for us is like, we can be at the farm. Hillary and the Rabbit Hill team do a great job every year of having all the all the brewers or distillers locally that are using their grains and using their products out on the farm during like right before harvest typically, so that everyone can see the plants that they'll be brewing with. They can touch them, they can step on them, they can chew on them, and I think for us that's one of the biggest components to having the farm local to us and working with the local product. This year is the first time we're doing a membership program of sorts at the brewery. We've always kind of found it quite corny and admittedly didn't want to tie ourselves to promises that we couldn't keep, but instead of like a lot of product or beer that someone would be paying for up front, we more so wanted to make it about the experience and help bring people, one step closer, a small group of people, one step closer into what we're so passionate about and what, gets us out of bed every morning. So it's really the bulk of that membership is two big events, one at Rabbit Hill, so that we can bring folks out there and walk some of our customers through the grain fields that will be, some of next season's saisons and next season's lagers, and next season's chip malt and the hoppy beer, because we do make that also. And then secondarily, another partner farm of ours where we can walk them through the flower fields and the fruit fields and such. But I think that's one of the biggest components for us. And I think what we'd like to see a little bit more of, which is nothing new or nothing secret. I think that's why we're all here and working on this, is just, continued growth in partnerships of helping to educate the consumer, and more so than educate the consumer, or maybe along the same lines in an ancillary fashion, just get them as excited about, such an integral, probably the most integral raw ingredient in beer.
Mike, knowing that you're committed, and I'm going to open this up for questions in just a minute. So just be on the lookout for me coming out after I ask Mike this question. Knowing you're committed to the malts that you're using, though, what would you find helpful to know from the growers, from the specialty providers, out there these days? Is there information that you still think that you could find interesting, as a brewer, as a curious person, that you'd like to hear more of, even knowing that you're just going to make the beers that you make?
Yeah, totally. Again, we are going to make collaboration brews at other breweries, keeping up on trends, and having a connection to agriculture is so vital to me as a person and us as a brewery, regardless whether we're using those local products or not. I think, again, I go up at least once a year up to the county to Mapleton for either planting or harvesting at Buck Farm. Even knowing that I'm not going to use their grain, it's still important to get in a combine and see a field of grain. And it makes you, I think, more, what's that term when you go into nature because it's good for your soul? Like, as a brewer, going into a field of grain is good for your soul as a brewer. Like, it's going to make you a better brewer. And bringing it full circle obviously is the best thing, and then using that grain, processing that grain and using it And I think that's something we'll continue to do. You know, it won't be in the two products that we're brewing right now, but again, collaboration beers, it will be. So I hope that this room, I'll leave one caveat. I think there's a little bit, I wish that, like, for instance, New England IPA needed to have New England grain in it, for instance. Like, as a beer person, that would make me happy to see a seal or like the whole brewing community come together and say, hey, there needs to be whatever it is, you know, 50% or whatever it is, some sort of style definition, because I think that's going to help us as a whole. Sorry to go off topic.
No. I mean,
that's why.
Question. Anybody have a question out there? All right, I'll start walking back. How would you guys feel about that, though? Should there be designations for New England styles to actually have New England grown malt?
I don't know if he can talk about this.
That's.
I love the idea. I think it would be great. I think, though, it's probably missed its time when it comes to that style, just because it's been, I mean, sure, I guess that same style brewed somewhere else could make it a hazy or whatever you want to call it. But to me, like, that was something that unfortunately breweries at that time missed the boat on. And I think looking back on it now, like, wish back then the breweries that were really at the forefront of that had done that. I mean, it would have been great. I think it would have been big help to a lot of the people in the room here starting out. I mean, a lot of the malting companies that started about the same time, about 10 years ago, and having some of that support back then would have been helpful, I think. Now there is the Northeast Grain Shed Alliance has a square foot project that, not to toot our own horn, Schilling joined this year, and that does put a designation on. You can put a designation on your packaged products or on your menu that says how much square foot of local grain went into each can or each pint or each keg, and that I think is I hope it's part of that process for educating the consumers that we were talking about earlier, that they see that immediately and it's something that they start to recognize on local products and realize that not every product that's made locally actually has local ingredients. I do think there are some consumers out there that, believe it or not, don't realize that, and they don't. And conversely, some don't realize that there are local products that do have local ingredients in them. There's just the assumption that they're all coming from somewhere else.
Michael, I was curious to know, when you were in the Czech Republic and you peeked into those grain rooms and you saw that common thread through those beers that you were enjoying was that Raven malt. Once you've brought it here, is it doing that same thing for you that was exciting about the beer in the Czech Republic? Is it doing it here in your brewery?
Having only used it in our brewery, it's hard to have that point of difference. But being a brewer for 17 plus years, it does make me excited when that palate comes in, and I know that we had to climb this mountain to get it there. It's part of our story. It's part of our identity. I'll give a quick caveat. Our first brew day ever, which was the first time me and my wife brewed together. We just put this brewery together, did all the math and calculations. First brew was spot on number wise, which was like crazy to think about. And a lot of that has to do with, we both have a lot of experience, but it's also comes back to the raw ingredients and having some understanding of the performance that we'd get out of it. So that, I guess, to answer your question is yes, we were both very excited to get that malt because it's the flavor is what we wanted and the performance is what we wanted.
We have a question back here.
Yeah, just to nerd out a little bit more on the Hanna Pilsner. I've never seen a full C of A on that malt. Could you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yes, maybe after this I actually brought COA with me as part of a presentation that we avoided doing. But I can go over all that stuff. It's a low, we'll go through it. But yes, and anyone else who wants to take a peek at that after the presentation.
Okay, so I'm not okay. Yeah, this thing is pretty loud. I'm a small grains breeder. We've been working on trying to, produce new varieties for this part of the country, the eastern U.S. right now there is not a supply chain that will make it so that you can really do this thing you're talking about having, say, New England IPAs, having New England grown grain. I mean, the total capacity is nothing, right? They tried this in New York, and it was a huge failure because New York used to grow barley, but that was like 100 years ago. And so there weren't any varieties in New York. And now the farm bill that they have that allows them to do that, I think they have to be up to like 90% in the next few years.
They've changed it a little bit.
Right. It's been modified, but it's still a big problem. We're not producing enough of it. And like storage is a huge problem. So how do you all see your part in helping build that supply chain from the perspective of making sure that there is demand and pull, right, from the brewing industry to make sure that we can get growers even starting to try to grow this stuff? And two, I still don't, what I don't know is I don't see what's going to happen between the growers and the malt houses. Where is that grain going to sit for the 3 to 6 months that it needs to sit before it's ready to malt? And like, what is your perspective on building that side of the chain?
So sorry to jump in, but I think from the brewery's perspective, really the only thing that we can help with is by making commitments to supporting. So the big one in this area, literally this area, is Allagash's commitment to using oats in Allagash White from Maine Malt House, all Maine grown, and that I think, I don't know, it was a ridiculous amount of grain. That project that they've been on for a few years involved, like they talk about the involvement that they had to have of basically making commitments to help with infrastructure. They had to go on their own learning adventure to understand how this would all be possible, because when they started out on that endeavor, they didn't even realize if it was even possible. So I think, I was at a farm in New Hampshire, and the farmer he was almost like literally just looking for somebody to raise their hand and be like, I will commit to buying 5 pallets of your grain next year, because he was making investments in his own infrastructure to change his farm, or to change part of his farm from dairy farming to growing grain for brewing and distilling. And that was something that really stood out to me. Like I'm not an expert on how to store grain for 3 to 6 months. So for me, it's more of like, what are the things that breweries can do to make commitments, whether it's promising to use something, making that promise known publicly so that there's some accountability to that. And if there are things that can be done financially to invest, for breweries to invest in that infrastructure and supply chain that you're discussing.
With contracts was the question.
Yeah, we had them for hops for years. They suck. I as a production manager who's trying to keep track of all of our raw ingredients, order them and stuff like that, I'm trying to move away from our contracts. They get us a few dollars of savings. They insure certain things, but not other things. And they're certainly supposed to, for the farmer, be a protection against bad years. I got bad news for hop farmers. There's a lot of bad years ahead. So for a brewery, it's really hard to make that commitment. It was certainly pivotal for hop contracting over the last 10 years or so for New England IPA brewers to be able to make sure that they had Galaxy, make sure that they had Nelson, things like that. So I think it's worth thinking about contracts for grain. But I think I'm not the only production manager in the country that's trying to get away from their hop contracts.
I'll jump in and mirror what Justin's saying real quickly about commitments. I think what the Guild is doing with the certified craft malt program is a step towards that. We jumped in on that with Rabbit Hill. So we're a certified craft malt brewery, which means we think this is incredibly low, by the way. We use contractually a minimum of 10% of our entire year's grain usage is coming from Rabbit Hill Farms. I think it's a nice entry level point. I think it's a great step. It's great to raise awareness. I think maybe some tiers to that would be helpful. Our first year of brewing, we used 41% of our grain came from Rabbit Hill. This year we're at about 2022, we should be about 56% or so. We haven't finalized that yet. But I think the commitments are huge. Personally, for us, we're small. So there's only so much we can do to put a dent in Rabbit Hill specifically's production for the year. All of our saisons, all of our lagers are all New Jersey grown grains. Every other beer we do has some component of New Jersey grown grains in them, but that only gets you so far from a farmer and a grower perspective when we're looking at, between a broad spectrum between 500 and 1,000 barrels a year. That's a little drop in the bucket. Another thing we do personally, not just to speak to our brewery, but I think is helpful is since we're so committed to local ingredients and local grain, every time we do a collaboration locally, we make sure that we are not doing that beer unless they're purchasing grain from Rabbit Hill. So a lot of that has been in New Jersey because it's easy, shipping wise and getting grain there. But even slightly over state lines, we have some friends of ours in Philadelphia that we just did a beer with that we split the grist 50-50 with Pennsylvania grown malt and New Jersey grown malt. So that's another thing we're trying to push is when we do a lot of these projects to really make it be a back and forth and not just throw a logo on something from a marketing perspective and help to kind of spread what we're so passionate about with those local ingredients as well. And not to end this on a negative note, but to say exactly what Justin said, I personally have never learned anything about raw grain storage. So outside of a production brewery type of setting. So those are some of the big picture questions that at least personally, I don't want to speak for everybody, but personally, I don't really know how the brewing industry really helps some of those obstacles in growing that supply chain side of things.
Yeah.
Jump in, Mike.
I'll jump on real quick. And that I think you hit the nail on the head is everyone in this room and everyone that was in the rooms last week at the Brewer Summit. I think everyone needs to remember that brewing is an extension of malting, and one hand's washing the other. And the more that maltsters understand the brewing process, and especially the more the brewers understand the malting process, you're gonna have a lot of bleed over to operations and commitments, and just more excitement as a holistic what beer is made of. I think this industry, especially as the smaller brewers, becoming the majority, the opportunity is there, and it's a shame. I'll point at myself for years and years and years, took it for granted. You look at open a catalog, order some grain. Oh, I'm brewing an English beer. I'll order some English grain, and just have that disconnect is so rampant. And we need, as an industry, it's not maltsters and separately brewers. We're all in this together. We need to be leaning on our brewers guilds, our governments. We have a lot of power if we get together and work on things together.
From a journalistic standpoint, I'll point out that covering beer for as long as I have now, the more interesting stories are when I hear about the collaborations that are using local malts or that are doing something that is not just, oh yeah, we're brewing an English beer and we pulled this out of a catalog and, beer in a box, here you go kind of thing. So, as you all, we're going to be talking about media tomorrow in a session, but as you all are working with local breweries to create something special, to provide grain for something special, keep your local websites, newspapers, radio stations, et cetera, involved in those conversations and in those announcements, because that's another great way of getting it out there. People are going to show up and be interested in hearing about beer, but if you can peel that layer back a little bit more. And I will say selfishly, Justin brought up what Allagash is doing on the All About Beer podcast, which M. Souter and Don Tess host. They had Jason Perkins from Allagash on a couple of weeks ago, and he went really deep into their craft malt program. So it's just all about beer on your podcast platform of choice. That's the only self-promotion that I'll do before passing it on to Dan Carey from New Glarus.
Real quick, sorry, Dan. I just want to say that's the one other thing I think breweries can do is that no offense to anybody in the room, but breweries have a pretty big sounding board these days and have a lot of followers on social media. There's a lot of great podcasts. There's a lot of all sorts of things that breweries are a part of, whether it's these panels, whatever it may be. And breweries need to, I think, be the ones that are constantly pushing the message out there so that it's going to eventually turn into more business for everybody else that's in the room here. I think that's an obligation that breweries need to start having. And I think we've already talked about like collab brewing as a big part of it. I'm actually this afternoon going over to Bissell Brothers, and we're using a floor malted pills from Maine Malt House for a brew this afternoon. And when they come over to our place, we're going to make sure that we use something local to us too, because I think that when we talked about terroir in the last session, that's what we're getting at. We're doing these collabs because we're going to other places. So what makes that place what it is?
I guess what I would like to say to small maltsters and farmers is that this is the first time I've come to this convention, and I really feel a sense of optimism. Certainly, there's more questions than there are answers, but it's a lot like what the Craft Brewing Conference was like 25, 30 years ago, although certainly your guys' future is going to be different than ours as brewers. But and it's going to be painful. Anybody that's going to stick around for the next 25 or 30 years, I know that if we talk then, if I'm still around, you're going to have a lot more battle scars. But I can tell you, I'm a big fan of how Toyota does business. There's a book called The Toyota Way, and I think anybody that is in manufacturing business should read that book. In that book, after World War II, of course, Japan was completely devastated, and Mr. Toyota took a trip to Detroit. And Detroit at that point was certainly smokestacks and rule the world, as you can imagine. And instead of being demoralized when he left, he was energized because he knew he could do better. And I think the reason is because he saw the cracks, the deficiencies. And a comment was made by Justin about lack of communication with large maltsters. And certainly large maltsters have supply chains, they have infrastructure, they have 100 plus years of experience, and those are all things that you don't have. And but you have something that they don't have. You have the ability to communicate directly with your customers and to move quickly. And I think when I work with craft maltsters, I can get on the phone with them and we can have conversations, and they can make things to fit my needs. And I think you just need to figure out, it's guerrilla warfare, and often, as we know, lesser armies defeat strong armies simply because they're more clever. So I think that you need to find out what your strengths are, and please don't don't pretend that you're a large maltster. You have to figure your own way around in this complicated world. And as I said, it's not going to be easy, but those of you that are brave and strong and clever, I think you're going to do really well. So good luck.
Any of you guys want to follow Dan Carey? All right. Thanks, Dan. Everybody, for coming out.
My thanks to the Craft Maltsters Guild for arranging this panel and for allowing us to use the audio for the podcast. Are you a brewer using craft malt or not? Let me know. You can email me. It's John Hall. That's JOHNHOLL at allaboutbeer.com, or you can tell me on Twitter at John_Hall. That's also how you can get in touch with questions, comments, and guest suggestions. A reminder, go visit allaboutbeer.com. There you can check out the podcast page, the merch page, and you can read great new content as well as the archives going back to 1979. Follow All About Beer on social media at All About Beer. And if you're interested in supporting journalism in the beer space, email us at info@allaboutbeer.com or simply go to patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Don't forget, All About Beer has a podcast channel now. You can search and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Steal This Beer is still on, 8 years strong now, and has new episodes every Monday. And the BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. As for the show, Mitch Weber does the music, Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Hall. New episodes release every Wednesday. And that's when I'm going to be back again to drink beer and to think beer.